The train screeched to a halt like a dying animal, iron wheels grinding against the dry blood tracks. Dust swirled in the low sunset, turning the horizon into a molten haze. The station at Dustfall wasn't much more than a plank platform, a half-painted depot shack, and a few rickety benches where shadows outnumbered people. Thomas Rourke stepped down from the last car, one boot planted in dirt that hadn't seen rain in weeks. He carried nothing but a worn satchel and a letter folded so many times it barely held together, an offer for land up in Montana Territory, stamped official by a government that couldn't promise much more than trouble. His eyes were the eyes of a man who'd watched too many things die. He was tall, broad-shouldered, face cracked with sun and time. His shirt clung damp to his back sweat and grief still fresh. 4 days earlier, he'd buried his wife in a potter's field in Kansas. Wrapped in the same quilt she'd brought from Tennessee, he hadn't cried. Not yet. He turned to leave the platform when he saw her. She was sitting alone on a weathered bench beneath a splintered sign that read, "Reserved for proper ladies." She didn't look like a lady the town would reserve much of anything for. Her dress a sunshine yellow thing that once might have been lovely pinched at her arms and clung too tightly at her stomach. The fabric was stained from travel, dust, and child handling. One arm was wrapped in a fresh bandage. On either side of her sat two girls, barefoot and sun-pinked, wearing matching burlap dresses and wide-brimmed bonnets. The older one clutched a rag doll with no face. The younger kept coughing into her sleeve. The woman's gaze never rose. Her shoulders were square with shame and fury, as if trying to will herself invisible. Thomas slowed behind him, the station master. Spat a brown stream into the dirt. "Mail order bride," he muttered, or was supposed to be. "Guess the groom changed his mind when he laid eyes on her. Happens more than you think." Thomas didn't answer, didn't ask. He just watched men. Walked past the woman without a glance or worse, with that slow grin of cruelty honed by boredom. One tipped his hat mockingly. Another said something under his breath that made the girl with the rag doll scoot closer to her mother. The woman never moved. She stood once, walked to the ticket window and asked, "Will the train be coming back this way tomorrow?" The ticket. Man didn't look up. "Next eastbound's 3 days late already?" "Maybe more. No guarantees. But She started, then closed her mouth. She looked back at her children. "Thank you kindly." She returned to the bench. The cough from the younger girl was getting worse. Thomas stood frozen, holding his letter like it might anchor him to anything that made sense. He'd come here with a plan, ride north, start over, build something on that scrap of Montana soil, alone, and yet he didn't leave. Dark clouds rolled in over the ridge like a cavalry charge, gunmetal and mean. The air changed. The light dimmed. Folks started scrambling, piling into wagons, tipping hats and disappearing down the muddy trail out of Dustfall. The wind kicked up sharp, sudden. Lightning cracked on the far side of the desert. Thomas looked once more at the woman on the bench. The younger girl had slipped while trying to stand and had started crying quiet, hard sobs that couldn't breathe. He moved before thinking. His boots hit the dirt, crossing the platform in wide strides. The child looked up at him, eyes wide and frightened. He bent down and gently helped her to her feet, brushing the dust from her dress. The woman stood sharply, defensive. "We'll be fine," she said. Her voice was firm, but her eyes betrayed her. They were glassy, tired, hungry. Thomas said nothing. Just turned and looked toward the road as the first drops of rain tapped against his neck. The storm came fast. It wasn't the kind that whispered. It screamed. Wind howled through the siding. Dust turned to mud in minutes. The entire town, such as it was, emptied into silence. Doors slammed, curtains closed. Thunder cracked over the plains, rattling the very boards beneath their feet. Thomas stood in the rain, hat soaked, watching the woman hold both her children close beneath her shawl, shielding them from the cold. She had nowhere to go. The station roof leaked. The last wagon had left a half-hour ago. It was just them now. "Ma'am," he said finally, voice low and steady. "I got a mule tied out back, a wagon with cover. Ain't much, but it's dry." She didn't answer. "You come with me, right out before the creek floods. I know a dry ridge 5 miles up. We camp there for the night, or—" He looked out into the storm. "You stay here and hope the floorboards hold?" She narrowed her eyes, suspicion rising. "Why? You want something?" He shook his head. "I'd buried my wife 4 days ago," he said quietly. "She didn't. Make it through the fever. I ain't looking for nothing. Just don't want to see more folks die for no good reason." Pearl studied him. Really studied him. The ragged edges of grief still clinging to his posture, the mud on his knees, the way he wasn't quite meeting her eyes. The older girl tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, I'm cold." Pearl looked down, then up again. Finally, she nodded once. "No thanks, no tears. Just survival." Thomas turned without a word and led them to the alley where the mule stood, ears twitching against the wind. He helped lift the girls into the wagon bed, then offered his hand to Pearl. She hesitated. Took it, her weight shifted. The wagon with a groan, but Thomas said nothing. Behind them, the storm swallowed Dustfall whole, and the bench sat empty under the flickering sign, "Reserved for proper ladies." But no one was left to read it. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled over the soupy trail, mud sucking at the spokes like it wanted to drag them all down. The sky above stayed the same gunmetal gray from Dustfall, only now it had settled into a steady, soaking drizzle that chilled everything it touched. Thomas kept one hand on the reins and the other resting loosely on his thigh. The mule pulled steady but slow, its ears twitching with every splash. In the back of the wagon, Pearl huddled with her 2 children beneath a patchy wool blanket. Her shoulders were hunched. Her dress clung to her back. Rain slicked her hair against her face, but she didn't complain. The only sound was the wind. And the boys coughed dry, sharp, and too frequent. No one spoke for miles. Pearl broke the silence first, her voice cutting through the rain like a threadbare melody. "Used to live near a river, back in Missouri," she said. "Had a little red porch swing. My husband first one-built it before the war. Never could sit still on it, though. Always fiddling with something, horseshoes, fence posts, anything but me." Thomas didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the road. His jaw worked once, then stopped. She smiled faintly, more to herself than anyone else. "Swing's probably still hanging there, rusted and rotten. Don't reckon anyone else came back to sit on it." The road dipped suddenly into a shallow ravine, the wheels thunking hard into the muck. The wagon tilted, creaked, and then a loud snap echoed through the rain. "Damn it," Thomas muttered. He climbed down into ankle-deep mud and crouched beside the rear wheel. One of the bolts had sheared clean off, axle jammed tight in the groove. Of a rock, he dug his hands into the wet earth and braced his shoulder under the wagon frame. Veins bulged down his arm as he pushed upward with a guttural growl, lifting the weight inch by inch. Pearl scrambled out, slipping on the mud, and knelt beside him. "Let me," she said, already reaching for the spare bolt in the tool sack. "You?" "Sure?" he asked, surprised. "I ain't glass," she said, biting down on the pin with her teeth to keep it in place while hammering it through. Rain dripped from her chin. Her arms shook, but the axle clicked back into place. Thomas looked at her, eyebrows slightly raised. "You done this before? Lived on farms my whole life. Broke more wagons than I fixed," she said, panting. "But I've never sat and cried beside one." He nodded once. And they moved on. By nightfall, they found shelter a ruined way station. Shack, the roof half caved in, but the awning dry enough to build a fire. The children lay curled together on a bed of dry straw, their cheeks flushed, the girl still clutching her rag doll. Thomas handed them a tin cup of warm water steeped with wild mint. Pearl sat a few feet away, hugging her knees. "His name was Walter," she said after a long silence. "The man who sent for me. Said he didn't mind my size. Said he wanted a strong woman who could work beside him. But when I stepped off that train, he looked me up and down, turned white as a sheet, and walked away. Didn't even take his hat." She laughed once, harsh and bitter. "Said I looked like a cow trying to wear a dress." Thomas didn't respond for a long time. The fire cracked. Between them, flames licking at the night air. "You don't gotta explain yourself," he said finally, voice low. You ain't the first person got left behind, and I don't reckon you'll be the last. Pearl looked up, blinking. He turned. Slightly away, eyes fixed on the flames. My wife was named Annie, got fever out near Fort Scott. I carried her near 100 miles before she stopped breathin'. By then, I couldn't dig a hole deep enough. The ground was frost-hard, so I burned her right there in the hills, wrapped her in her quilt, stood there all night and watched till nothin' was left. He looked down at his hands. I ain't been right since. No one spoke. Even the wind went still for a moment. The older girl stirred, crawled over with her biscuit crumbly, half-eaten, and held it out to Thomas. For you, she said softly. He took it slow and careful. Thank you, darlin'. Pearl watched, her eyes glassy but dry. Later, as the fire settled into glowing coals and frost crept along the corners of the tarp, Thomas told them the story. His voice was scratchy but warm. There's a town up north, real place, called Ghost Hollow. No one lives there anymore, but they say you can still hear music on Sunday mornings. Piano playing, no fingers touching the keys. The little girl giggled and clutched her doll tighter. Pearl smiled faintly. Arms wrapped around her knees. In the morning, they loaded the wagon again. Thomas tied a fresh strap around the axle just in case. The mule snorted and stamped, eager to get moving. They rode for hours in silence, then Pearl turned toward him. Why'd you even stop for us? Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed forward, fixed on the horizon. Finally, he shrugged. Didn't like the way the wind sounded with you still sitting there. Pearl looked at him a long moment, then turned away. The wagon creaked on, cutting through fog and empty plains, the road ahead long and full of ghosts. But they weren't alone anymore. The road narrowed to a ribbon of rutted earth, winding into a tree-choked gulch they called Blue Hollow. The mule's ears twitched uneasily, and the wind carried the sour smell of wood smoke and sweat fresh. Too fresh? Thomas slowed the wagon. Ahead. 3 men stepped out of the trees. They looked like shadows carved from rot and regret sun-leathered skin, torn gray coats, pistols half-holstered. One had a scar splitting his lip wide. Another wore a rusted saber on his belt. The third lean, with a stained Confederate flag tied around his arm, grinned like he'd just found supper. Well, what do we got here? The leader drawled, stepping closer. Nice wagon, real nice. His eyes drifted to Pearl, then settled on her figure like he was measuring cattle. And a fine woman, big-boned, but some men like more to hold. What's a pretty cow like her doing with a broken down? Mule like you? Thomas didn't flinch. Pearl, he said evenly, eyes forward. Take the kids, into the trees, now. She hesitated, hand frozen on her daughter's shoulder. Now? Pearl jumped down and ushered the children toward the brush, her own body shielding theirs. The bandits laughed. Ain't no need for all that, said the second one, fingering his revolver. We're friendly folk. We just need your supplies. And maybe a few minutes with the lady? Thomas dismounted slow. His boots hit the dirt, and for a breathless moment no one moved. You want the supplies? Take he said. But the rest? That's not happening. The man with the scar lunged. Thomas moved fast, too fast for a man burdened by grief. His shotgun came up in a flash, barrel barking thunder across the hollow. The first man dropped, shoulder blown wide open, but the second rushed him with a blade. Steel flashed. Thomas twisted, too late, blood sprayed as the knife cut deep across his shoulder. Pearl screamed. Thomas stumbled back but fired again, the shot hitting the attacker square in the gut. The man collapsed, gurgling. The third bandit ran. Thomas swayed, blood pouring down his arm, dark against his shirt. Pearl was beside him in seconds, tearing her shawl from her shoulders and wrapping it tight around the wound. Her hands were shaking, her breath coming hard. Don't be a fool, she hissed. Don't die here, don't you dare, Thomas winced. Should have kept riding. Now they'll come back with more. We'll find shelter, Pearl said, voice shaking. There's gotta be something. They moved fast, Thomas leaning against the wagon. Blood seeped through the shawl, warm and steady. A mile off the trail, half hidden in the trees, they found a decaying cabin, the roof sagging, walls bowed inward, but dry. Pearl helped him inside. The children clung to her skirt, wide-eyed and silent. She found a dusty jar of dried herbs and boiled water in an old kettle. The smell of sage and willow filled the room. She cleaned his wound with firm hands, muttering under her breath. "You're lucky," she said. "If he'd gone deeper, you wouldn't be talking." Thomas lay back against the wall, sweat coating his brow. "I ain't lucky," he mumbled. "Just too stubborn to fall over." The children curled beside her as night fell. Pearl sang to them, a soft, broken lullaby. Her voice cracked halfway through, but she finished. Thomas watched her. From the shadows, she wasn't polished. She wasn't gentle. But she was strong in a way that couldn't be faked. "I ain't a hero," he said hoarsely. Pearl turned to him. "I just didn't want to see you or those kids hurt. You think I don't know that?" She whispered. "But you still bled." "For us, most men would have handed us over and walked away." She sat beside him. The fire cracked low. Outside, a coyote padded silently past the window, yellow eyes glinting in moonlight. Neither of them spoke again. Morning broke in shades of gray. Thomas stirred first. His shoulder throbbed like it held fire beneath the skin. A twig snapped outside. He stood slowly, reaching for his shotgun. Then 3 shapes emerged from the trees. One was the bandit from the day before, the runner now, with a rifle, and 2 fresh-faced boys trailing him. But before Thomas could raise the gun, another figure appeared, silent and fast. A tomahawk flashed in the sunlight. The boy with the rifle dropped without a sound. The second man turned to run, but was met by a whipcord blur and the butt of a bow crashing into his skull. The last, the original bandit, froze. And there he stood, a tall, lean figure wrapped in a worn buffalo hide coat. One eye missing, the other sharp as obsidian. A half-braided mohawk framed his face. His presence sucked the sound from the clearing. He stepped forward, tomahawk dripping. The bandit dropped his weapon. Caleb said nothing, just nodded toward the trees. The man ran. Thomas lowered the shotgun. Blood had soaked through the bandage again, but he stood. "Who are you?" he asked, breath shallow. The one-eyed man didn't answer at first. He simply knelt beside the fire pit, examining the ashes. Finally, in a voice deep and quiet, he said, "Too many men think it brave to kill for fun. You are different." Thomas said nothing. "I am called Caleb," the man added. "I know this. Land better than the wind. You need to get north. They'll send more." Thomas nodded, wary but grateful. Pearl stepped beside him, hands resting on the children's heads. Caleb glanced at her, at Gavin, then back at Thomas. "I'll guide you until it's safe." And just like that, a new shadow joined. "There's Dot." They broke camp by noon, the trail ahead twisting through pine, danger, and something else. Hope, silent and sharp as a knife. The trail Caleb led them down wound through thick trees and scattered boulders, until it opened suddenly into a quiet valley, untouched, forgotten, and framed by the rise of pale hills. Grass rolled gold in the wind. Birds wheeled overhead. The stream nearby gurgled with spring melt. And there it was, a single cabin, half standing, moss climbing the sides. A stone chimney still firm. Roof sagging but not fallen. Thomas froze. His eyes swept the clearing like he was seeing a ghost. He walked slowly toward the porch, every step heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he put a hand on the frame. His fingers trembled. "This place," he whispered. "I told her about it, said I'd fix it up. We'd plant a little corn. She could hang herbs from the rafters." He leaned his forehead against the wood. "She died before she ever saw it." Pearl watched him from a few feet away, one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. Thomas didn't cry. Not exactly. But his body sagged, and a sound came out of him that wasn't words, just loss. Pearl stepped forward. She picked up a loose board, held it out. "Well," she said quietly, "it ain't gonna fix itself." They worked for hours. Thomas hammered the door straight while Pearl patched the cracks between the logs with clay and dry moss. Caleb disappeared without a word, whether into the trees or simply onward, they never knew. His silence had been his goodbye. The children ran, wild in the meadow, barefoot and laughing. They waded into the stream, chasing minnows and throwing rocks. The air was sweet with pine and wet earth. A mule grazed lazily under the slope, and birds had started to return, sparrows and flickers calling to each other from the trees. That night they sat on the rebuilt porch. The sun dipped low behind the hills, bleeding amber light across the land. Pearl wrapped her shawl tighter and looked at her children. "He's not your father," she told them softly. "But he's what?" "Your father should have been." Thomas didn't say anything. Just stared out at the field. Later, after they'd gone inside, he stayed behind. The sky turned violet and soft, and stars began to blink through. He crouched near the porch steps and dug a small hole in the dirt. From his coat pocket he pulled out a small silver pendant, a simple, faded thing that had belonged to Annie. He kissed it once, then buried it. No words. Just a final act. Pearl found him sitting on the steps, his hands dirty, his eyes distant. He looked up when she approached. "This land," he began. "This cabin. I can't live here alone again. I did that once and it near killed me." Pearl stood quiet. "I ain't a skin for anything you don't want," he added. "And I know I ain't owed a damn thing. But," he turned toward her fully. The firelight inside flickered over his face, softening the scars. "I just don't want to start over alone." Pearl let out a breath. Her lips curled into something between a smile and a tremble. "I ain't looking to be saved," she whispered. He nodded. "Me neither." Then, from his coat, he pulled out a simple band, his wife's old wedding ring. No speech. No preacher. No vows. He held it out, wordless. Pearl looked at it a long moment, then she slipped it onto her finger. They didn't kiss. They didn't embrace. They just sat together, leaning shoulder to shoulder, the porch creaking beneath them. Behind them, inside the cabin, the children's laughter rang out soft and real. The sun dipped below the ridge, the sky turned gold, and fireflies began to rise from the grass. In the last light of day, their silhouettes remained, one tall and worn, the other round and rooted, watching the children chase the last flickers of summer across a field that now, finally, belonged to them. Closing narration. Sometimes love doesn't ride in on a white horse. Sometimes it limps in with a mule, scarred and quiet, but willing to stay. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.